Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, December 14th, 2018. Yesterday, the United States Senate, after some obstruction from Republican Tom Cotton of Arkansas, passed two resolutions. And it's an important step for the Senate to take positions on the bloody, brutal war in Yemen and the role of Saudi Arabia. But the bottom line is nothing will come of these Senate resolutions. It does show the sense of the Senate that they don't agree with Trump and that they do want to see some shifts in U.S. policy. And I credit Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, who is likely to launch a new campaign for president in the next few weeks. He has led the charge on this. And he, you can say, well, once Khashoggi was assassinated in Istanbul, it really changed the chemistry, and so this wasn't as much of a heavy lift. But to be fair to Sanders, he has been staking out stronger positions on foreign policy than he did in 2016, and this is one example of that. And he has been, there was a vote earlier this year that he lost. He and his co-sponsor Mike Lee of Utah, under the War Powers Act, trying to rein in the involvement of the United States in this misadventure with the Saudis in Yemen. So it's a mixed result. I give the Senate credit, a 56-41 vote, separating themselves from the president and essentially urging that we end our involvement in the war in Yemen. But it is an urge. They didn't cut off funding. They didn't say that we're going to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It was just a sense of objection. And then the objection moved to outrage when a measure passed unanimously, and that is so rare in the Senate these days, which tagged, I almost called him Osama, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, as responsible for the Khashoggi assassination. So these are bold steps in a time when there's very little bold action that is being taken. And as I say, there are no teeth. There are no penalties. There's no cancellation of any arms sales to Saudi Arabia. They're not demanding a complete reworking of U.S. relationships with the Saudis. And the big question here is the timing. Because, as you may know, in Sweden, the Secretary General of the United Nations brokered a deal between the Houthi rebels in Yemen and what passes for the remaining government there. And if the truce holds, the ceasefire is supposed to go into effect with the port city of Hodeidah being reopened within 21 days. But will the Saudis observe this ceasefire? Will they stop it's the daily bombing raids on their neighboring country? And that remains to be seen. Also, I want to credit 7 Republican senators who joined Democrats to pass this resolution. Lee of Utah, Collins of Maine, Daines of Montana, Flake of Arizona, Moran of Kansas, Paul of Kentucky, and Young of Indiana. What's interesting to me is that Bob Corker, who chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for the next 20 minutes before he's termed out, well, he didn't vote for this, even after making those kinds of noises for many months. Now, speaking of Bernie Sanders, I did reference that it's not a secret. He's got committees ready to roll, and sometime in January we expect that he will announce he's running for president. Likewise, Elizabeth Warren, who had a meeting with Bernie in Washington last night, attracting a little irritation from Sanders, who wanted to know why the media cares that he was going to have an evening meeting with the senator from Massachusetts. But the two of them have some things in common. I will always deplore that Elizabeth Warren would not break with the centrists in the Democratic Party and endorse Bernie Sanders, who mirrored her economic policies in 2016. But that's behind us, and I'm sure Bernie is over that as well. And there are lots of people coming out of the woodwork. Julian Castro, the congressman from San Antonio, is throwing his hat in the ring. Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Swalwell, a congressman from the Bay Area here in California. It appears we may have more than a dozen Democrats running by the time the primaries gear up in 2020. So it's all early, and I welcome everyone to the field. I don't think Bernie Sanders has any kind of a lock or a early advantage other than name recognition, and that there are a lot of people who feel that Bernie got burned by the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton family, and that he deserves another shot at it. One of the other things that I'll criticize virtually all of the Democratic candidates for is that they are afraid of the Israel lobby, and they will not take a position supporting boycott, divestment, and sanctions aimed toward Israel until that nation modifies its draconian policies and the occupation of Palestinian territory. And I was pleased to watch a video, and I'm linking to it in the show file for this podcast. The reporter at The Intercept, Mehdi Hassan, did an 8-minute video package where he really peels back the truth about BDS. And he points out the clear hypocrisy of people like Governor Cuomo of New York, many Democratic leaders who toe the AIPAC line and refuse to understand or acknowledge that we have the right to use our power in boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. These are nonviolent ways to try to affect policy and to single out critics of the state of Israel and say that we are anti-Semitic because we support BDS is just so insulting. And it's disconcerting to see so many of our elected leaders parrot that line. I encourage you to click on the link and watch Mehdi Hassan's video about BDS. So yesterday, Michael Cohen was blamed by Trump. It's all Cohen's fault that Cohen pled guilty and said that the president directed him to pay hush money to Stormy Daniels and to arrange the deal with the National Enquirer to buy Karen McDougal's story and bury it. And again this morning on the way to the Secret Studio, listening to Rush Limbaugh, he's channeling Trump and just, finding all ways to get his listeners to embrace denial that Trump has done anything wrong. And what's fascinating is they're now, giving up the charade that he didn't have sex with McDougal or Daniels. We don't have proof, of course, but, nobody doubts that those women are telling the truth. And so now the dismissal and the denial is related to, well, it's not even a crime. The campaign finance law says that you have to knowingly violate it, and Trump can probably argue that he was ignorant of it. But Michael Cohen on ABC yesterday asked if Trump's denial that he had ordered him to make the payments was true. Cohen said, "I don't think there's anybody who believes that. First of all, nothing at the Trump Organization was ever done unless it was run through Mr. Trump. He directed me, as I said in my allocution, and as I said as well in the plea, he directed me to make the payments. He directed me to become involved in those matters." And on ABC, he said that he had been loyal to somebody who truthfully does not deserve loyalty. "One of the hopes that I have out of the punishment I've received, going to prison, as well as the cooperation I've given, I will be remembered in history as helping to bring this country back together." Well, Mike, that's a little grandiose. But I guess he sees himself as the John Dean of this tortured presidency. And for those of you who don't recall Watergate or weren't born yet, John Dean was the White House counsel who famously told Nixon there was a cancer on the presidency. And he at that point flipped and exposed the crimes of others in the Nixon White House. But as I mentioned, it's amazing to see Rush Limbaugh simply deny the obvious problem, the legal exposure that Trump has. And he shifts to whataboutism, saying, the Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation pay to play. Now, as you know, I have deep suspicions about criminal behavior at the Clinton Foundation and the connection between the foundation and Hillary when she was Secretary of State. And I wish we could have an honest investigation of that. But it has nothing to do with Trump's exposure and the implications made by both the plea of the National Enquirer and the plea of Michael Cohen. Now we're told that the leak-proof Mueller investigation is investigating whether foreign money was pumped into a super PAC that supported Trump or to the inaugural committee that raised much more than it spent for the Trump installation. Now, as I mentioned, the so-called leak-proof Mueller special counsel investigation appears to be the source of this story. The New York Times says only according to people familiar with the inquiry. And so the Times, building on its investment in the Trump-Russia narrative, says that Mueller is focusing on whether anyone in the Trump campaign conspired with Russia to tip the election in Trump's favor, while prosecutors in New York are pursuing evidence that he secretly authorized illegal payments of hush money to silence the accusations. And now there is a third investigation into Thomas Barak Jr., the billionaire financier who raised money for both of those funds. And the super PAC, we believe, was one of the entities that used the same media buying firm as the NRA to place Trump's TV ads during the campaign. And as you know, I suspect that is a very rich area for the investigators to probe into. So this guy Barak said that Paul Manafort helped him decide to join this committee. It appears that they violated the election laws by bringing in people who'd been on the Trump campaign to run this super PAC. They're supposed to be separate. But, of course, those laws are not enforced in the ordinary course of business because the Federal Election Commission is toothless. So what's also interesting is that we're learning that Barak and Manafort, after Manafort got fired from the Trump campaign in August of 2016, went on a Mediterranean cruise. And they just happened to encounter one of the world's richest men, Hamad bin Jassim bin Jaber Al Thani, the former prime minister of Qatar, who ran the $230 billion sovereign wealth fund. Now, all of this circumstantial evidence is pretty damning, but we have to find out if there really was any infusion of non-American money into either the super PAC or into the Trump inaugural committee. Now, we know that a friend of Melania's got paid $26 million from the inaugural fund. I'm certain that much of that was paid out to vendors. I don't expect that she pocketed all that. But they raised $106 million, and nobody has ever explained where all that money went or where it came from. I have allowed over the last few days that when you look carefully at the details of Mike Flynn's adventure with the FBI following his denial of a phone call with the Russian ambassador, there is a plausible case of entrapment. And because of the paywall at the Wall Street Journal, I'm a little frustrated. I was able to read the entire article via Facebook last night, but when I attempted to access it again today and print it out, I hit the paywall, and I refused to pay Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal any money to read their articles. But the editorial board published a piece on December 12th, which makes a strong case that Mike Flynn was entrapped and that James Comey, Andy McCabe, and Peter Strzok, the trio at the top of the FBI, put together a scheme that led to his embarrassing departure from the Trump administration. If you have a subscription or access to the Wall Street Journal, I encourage you to check out that story. Theresa May really stacks up as the loser of the week, in my opinion. She did survive the no-confidence vote of her Conservative Party in the Parliament, but she is a woman without a country, and she's been kind of meandering through her pals in the European Union, saying, hey, can you help me pass Brexit in Britain? And that is so bizarre, because, of course, the European Union didn't want Brexit. They don't want to facilitate this self-inflicted wound that Britain is determined to go through with. And the best example I can come up with, it's like asking your ex to help you with something that broke up your marriage or your relationship. And I think that Theresa May is a sorry figure on the world stage today. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Mary Vogt just renewed her annual subscription. Thanks a lot, Mary. Also, Billy Cook in Eureka, Dick Atlee in Maine, Jeff Stewart, I'm not sure where Jeff is. They all kick in $5 or $10 a month. You know, it's the cost of a hipster coffee. And here during the holidays, I add an extra little appeal to those of you who listen on a regular basis but have never gotten around to taking up a subscription. Come on over to peterbcollins.com. You find the menu tab, click on it, click on Become a Subscriber. It takes you to the sign-up page where in just a second or two you can choose what the level of support that fits your budget. And you can also pick that $50 annual subscription. I'll give you the bonus gift of John Dist's rock and roll CD, American University, if you take out that annual subscription and give me a mailing address in the continental United States. A couple of stories on Facebook today. Yesterday, or maybe it was a couple of days ago this week, they opened up a series of kiosks in public places, like in Bryant Park in New York City. These kiosks have employees who are there to explain about how privacy is the foundation of Facebook and to try to soften the blow of the repeated exposures of our private data that Facebook has been responsible for. Just, it's been disclosed, not all of it occurred in this past year. Now, these kiosks popped up at about the same time that Facebook was forced to admit belatedly that there was another breach, because Facebook has admitted that a security flaw potentially exposed the public and private photos of as many as 6.8 million users on Facebook to developers. Now, the way it works is if you post a photo on Facebook, it's possible that you don't go all the way through. You can upload it to Facebook, but then not click the final button that posts it. Well, Facebook saves that, even if you didn't post it. And in addition to the photographs, in October, the scope of the breach widened with reports that the vulnerability exposed not just some users' emails and phone numbers, but profile information including gender, location, birth dates, and recent search history. So that's two massive vulnerabilities in the matter of months. And on top of that, The Guardian reported, I think 2 days ago, actually yesterday, December 13th, that many of the people who were hired by Facebook to be fact-checkers, to fight the scourge of fake news, they are really, really unhappy. Some of them came over from Snopes, like Brooke Binkowski, a former managing editor of Snopes. And by the way, I don't think Snopes has biblical levels of accuracy. I do look at Snopes occasionally if I'm not sure if something is true, but I do not consider it to be definitive, merely informational. Anyway, current and former Facebook fact-checkers told The Guardian that the company's collaboration with outside reporters has produced minimal results and that they've lost trust in Facebook, which has repeatedly refused to release meaningful data about the impacts of their work. So Binkowski says they've essentially used us for crisis PR. They're not taking anything seriously. They're more interested in making themselves look good and passing the buck. They clearly don't care. Now, Facebook now has more than 40 media partners, including the Atlantic Council, the Associated Press, and the Weekly Standard. And I don't find those to be unbiased arbiters of what is or is not factually true. And some of the partners also were really upset that Facebook had hired this consulting firm to go after opponents by publicizing their association with billionaire philanthropist George Soros. The attacks fed into a well-known conspiracy theory about Soros being the hidden hand behind all manner of liberal causes and global events. So one of the fact-checkers, who doesn't want to give her name, said, "Why should we trust Facebook when it's pushing the same rumors that its own fact-checkers are calling fake news? It's worth asking, how do they treat stories about George Soros on the platform, knowing they specifically pay people to try to link political enemies to him? Working with Facebook makes us look bad, they said. So another one unloaded this way. They're a terrible company on a personal level. I don't want to have anything to do with them. Binkowski left Snopes earlier this year, has her own fact-checking site. And she said, the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, I brought it up over and over. They were absolutely resistant. And that is one of the biggest errors that Facebook has belatedly acknowledged. So it's quite a revealing attack on what's really going on at Facebook. And today I'm proud to share with you a fresh in-depth interview with investigative journalist Greg Palast. And I want to reveal a couple of things before I play a clip from the interview. One is that when I went to Los Angeles the first week of December, I recorded a great interview with Greg Palast, but it was eaten by my recording device. And when I tried to salvage it, it was hopeless. So it took me a few weeks to get back to Greg, and he gave me a powerful interview today. And when you listen to it, you'll notice that I use a musical theme at the beginning that says, James Brown is dead. And the reason is that in the interview, Greg Palast explains how in Georgia, Secretary of State turned governor, Brian Kemp, who basically managed his own election, rigged his own election, well, he purged over 500 guys named James Brown from the voter rolls in the state of Georgia. And here's Greg Palast talking about after the purge, how voters who re-registered showed up and were still not listed on the voting rolls and then were denied provisional ballots.
The Democratic Party, after I was writing some of my stuff, did write to Kemp and say, look, you're purging all these people. We disagree, but if nothing else, you should at least print provisional ballots so when they show up, because under federal law, if you say, I'm a citizen, I live here, don't tell me that my name is gone. Oh, then give me a provisional ballot and I'll fill it out and put my information on, and then we can fight over whether it should be counted later. Kemp deliberately refused to print enough provisional ballots, knowing there was going to be a flood of voters needing them. He didn't print them. All over Atlanta, all over Gwinnett County in the black areas, they ran out of provisional ballots like by 10 or 11 in the morning, so that people couldn't even get them. And Kemp doubled down by getting the counties to tell poll workers, don't give out provisional ballots. If someone's not on the voter rolls, they can't get a provisional ballot. Well, that's the whole point of the provisional ballot law. So, and I'm not making this up. I was in a polling station with a woman named Ashley Jones. She's a Latina, and she was purged. She found herself on my purge list, and she said, oh, okay, I'll re-register. She re-registered in time, and they still didn't accept her registration. They kept jacking around. So she shows up at the polling station, and I'm there with my camera crew. They say, well, your name isn't here. She says, look, here's my receipt showing I properly registered. Nope. So then they kept sending her around table, and she was asking for a provisional ballot. And I had on camera that they said, you can't get a provisional ballot. And I said, and with the cameras rolling, federal law says you have to give this lady a provisional ballot, and I'm calling lawyers. So I called some lawyers, et cetera, and this woman got nervous. There were other national camera people with camera crews there with the cameras on, and they suddenly decided, oh, they're going to give her a provisional ballot. Thanks a lot. But they said, but we're not going to count it.
I'll be releasing the full interview with journalist Greg Palast later today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. And I hope you will listen. It is uncensored, and Greg goes off, particularly when we talk about the way the New York Times has covered these rigged elections, going all the way back to 2000. On Facebook last night, one of my friends, Sister Helen Prejean, posted an article that got my attention. It reads, Alvin Brazil is dead. The state of Texas killed him on Tuesday, December 11th, 2018. Now, Brazil was convicted of a crime based on testimony from a woman who had an emotional breakdown while she was on the stand. And a mistrial was filed for but denied after that testimony was questioned and the issue of malpractice or inappropriate behavior by prosecutor George West was raised by the defense. So, that issue goes back to the trial in 2001. Fast forward. On December 11th of this year, Brazil is scheduled for execution in Texas. The day before, less than 24 hours before the scheduled execution, one of the trial prosecutors, Tom DeMore, called the current prosecution team and said that his colleague, George West, had implied that he purposely provoked the victim's outburst. Before turning to examine the victim on the stand, he turned to DeMore and said, "Watch this." Now, many questions surface here. Why did DeMore wait until the last hour? Why did he decide to reveal this after silence of many years? But the misconduct by the prosecutors in this case, present and past, is very clear. And even after the information was passed along to courts, they refused to grant a stay of execution. The trial court said, well, I need a sworn statement by 5:30 p.m. because the execution is scheduled for 7. And they got this guy DeMore to email a statement, but the trial court said that was insufficient, and the execution went forward, despite the significant issues that should have been heard before the authorization was given. Here's another case of ugly human behavior and a preventable loss of life. A 7-year-old girl from Guatemala who was traveling to the United States with her father. They crossed the border in New Mexico, and they turned themselves in to the Border Patrol. This has become a common practice. They're applying for asylum. And they took the father and daughter into custody. 8 hours later, the daughter died of dehydration. Now, we need an investigation to know how she was handled. Apparently, there may have been as many as 100 people there, and they were processing them. But to go 8 hours and not address her need for water and her whatever symptoms surfaced during that time, that is inexcusable and inhumane. The new president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, also known as AMLO, he has floated a proposal for a $20 billion development plan, kind of like a new Marshall Plan for Latin America, aimed at providing economic opportunities in order to reduce migration toward the United States. And the plan would be funded by Mexico, the United States, and the 3 Central American countries that produce the most refugees and migrants. That would be Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. The new foreign minister met with Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, laid out the plan. Pompeo apparently just kind of neutral on it. But I think that this is an interesting proposal coming from the new socialist-leaning president of Mexico, and I think it deserves some serious discussion. We'll see where it goes. A couple of quickies here. John Kyle, who was the longtime senator from Arizona, retired, became a lobbyist. When John McCain died, they plugged him in temporarily, and he announced today that he's resigning at the end of the year because he can't get by on the pay in the United States Senate. He's developed a lifestyle based on being a corporate lobbyist. So it's really doubtful that a lobbyist should have been able to serve as an interim senator, but these days there are no standards of ethics enforcement. So Kyle's going to resign, and now there's a scramble to decide who will take his place. In Wisconsin, it's expected that Scott Walker, the guy who's been a real bare-knuckled politician and opponent of Democrats and unions since he started his 3 terms as governor of Wisconsin. Actually, he lost on his try for the 3rd term. Let me get that correct. Anyway, it is expected that he will sign the bills that would diminish the power of his Democratic successor and expand the authority of legislative Republicans, and that's hardly news. But I think we've been following that, so I wanted to update you on it. Here in California, for years, I have railed against what I call the rogue utility, Pacific Gas and Electric. And they are identified as a criminal corporation. Their negligence caused the deaths of 10 or 11 people in San Bruno when a gas pipeline exploded there about 10 years ago. And the wildfires last year and again this year have led PG&E to request from the utility commission that they run, shouldn't be that way, but they do, more money from ratepayers. They want to increase our bills by about $10 a month to pay for wildfire suppression. They want to trim trees and harden their power lines, the things that they should have been doing all along and that are budgeted for under the current rate structure. And so I find this really just to be the last straw. And I believe that the ratepayers will ultimately pay for the blunders of Pacific Gas and Electric. And so why don't we dispense with these formalities? And I champion a public takeover. The state should buy controlling interest in the holding company of Pacific Gas and Electric because their stewardship is a proven failure. And finally today, this one's a little personal. My late friend John Ames spent the last 15 years of his life taking care of his son David, who was then in his 40s. David developed ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And they went everywhere in the world to get, drug trials and special treatment. And one of the things they did was make several trips to Brazil, where David Ames met with the man who is a faith healer known as John of God. And I didn't criticize them for this. In a situation where your life expectancy is sharply limited, I believe you should take every step you can to try to extend that, even if it is believing in superstition and false gods. Well, John of God, also known as João de Deus in Portuguese, age 76, has now been accused by more than 200 women of rape and other forms of sexual abuse. And when you couple that with the sordid record of the Catholic Church, the cardinal from Australia has been found guilty, and Pope Francis has not been on the ball in dealing with this crisis. And as an agnostic, I have no investment in propping up religion. I just hate to see so many people taken in and bamboozled year after year. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it with absolutely everybody, and you'll find it on YouTube in so many cases. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.